Joel, really good to see you, and thank you very much for being on the road with me this week.
Chuck, that's great. I'm happy to be here. The road is always a good place.
The road is always a good place. We got to get back on the road right after all this COVID mess.
Absolutely. Yes, it's a little strange being penned up when you're used to traveling.
Yeah, it's not. I like being out in the open road and selling wines, like I'm sure you do as well.
I do too. One of the joys you get from this business, other than making wine, is sharing it with people and talking about it. And I love talking about California wine. So I'm right in my element when I'm out there on the road.
Yeah, well, it's going to be nice to have you back in London, Joel. I hope it's. I hope it's soon. And Joel, I have to tell you, I love Zinfandel. I had John Olney on last week. Bob Bialy, who you sit on the board with, the Historic Vineyard Society. We're just talking about Brian Parker. I had him on it early on in the year, and then a few weeks back, I had Shelley Raffinelli on in April, and I think you'd have to agree, all awesome Zin producers, like yourself. So now and I can't think of a better way to kick off this 4th of July episode. And, a barbecue wine. I think let me repeat that. Nothing better goes with barbecue than I think a good Zinfandel red. So kicking off and taking a step back in time to when you first launched Ravenswood, what drew you to Zinfandel?
Well, it's interesting. I grew up tasting European wine. My father had a wine newsletter. And what I learned about European wine was that it came from someplace. So Pinot Noir wasn't grown all over Europe. It was famous in Burgundy. Chardonnay, true the same way. They didn't grow Bordeaux varieties in the Rhone. They grew them in Bordeaux. So wine came from someplace. Each place had its sort of signature variety. And when I started making wine in California, I was actually interested in making a Bordeaux blend. But there weren't that many, this is 1976, there weren't that many mixed vineyards planted at that particular juncture. And I happened to be lucky enough to run into a guy named Joseph Swan, who really wanted to make Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but he was practicing with Zinfandel, and he taught me to make wine. And I thought, wow, the Zinfandel stuff is pretty good. And I ran into Andrei Chelichev at that time, and he was talking about the history of California. And I began looking around and recognizing that old vine Zinfandel in California had been there for a long time. And the more I looked at that, the more I understood that Zinfandel and the mixed blacks, really, those vineyards were frequently had other grape varieties in them other than Zinfandel, were the core variety of California wine. There was more of it planted really in those days than anything else. And it made some of California's very interesting wines that were totally unique to the place that they came from, and totally unique to California. So because of my general propensity to believe in wine that came from someplace, and because it was clear to me that Zinfandel was that wine for California, I jumped on the bandwagon.
Wow. And then plus, talking earlier, you obviously have strong roots yourself to California. Your family goes back a few generations, correct? So did that help make that decision easier in terms of giving something a sense of place and a sense of history?
Well, I don't know. My family arrived, they were whalers that arrived in Petaluma in 1851, which is just about exactly the same time Zinfandel showed up. Of course, I learned that much later. I like to say, serendipity, chance. I think not. It was like obvious, but in fact, probably didn't play a factor in my thinking about Zinfandel, other than the fact that my father had done a number of write-ups on Zinfandel, and there was a controversy around it. So I was exposed to it relatively early, and I knew that there was an occasional wine that was being made back then that was competitive with great European wines. And I thought, okay, this is the right thing to do for California.
So yeah, talking to Bob Bialy, obviously, like you just mentioned, there was. Let me repeat that. Talking to Bob Bialy, like you just mentioned, there was a lot of Zinfandel plantains or vines back then, correct? I mean,
Oh,
more
absolutely.
more so than Cabernet and Merlot than you see today. So back then, you mentioned you mentioned Joe Swan, you mentioned Andre there. I mean, was Andre making wine as well? And how old was he back then when you first met him? I mean, that must have been amazing working with somebody like him.
Well, Andre retired from BV. I think his last vintage was 1970. Um, I met him in 1972 originally. He was considered at the time to be, one of California's premier winemakers. And he was still closely allied with BV, but he was also doing consulting. And he and Joe Swan were very good friends, but he also consulted for Joe Swan. So I got some of um, the wisdom by osmosis when Andre was around. Uh, he was he was old then. I mean, he was probably my age, probably in his 70s. But he lived into his 90s, and he was just this you know kind of tough little Russian with very strong ideas about how the world worked. Uh, back to your comment about Zinfandel and planters. Zinfandel arrived here in the mid 1850s, and by 1888, it was the most planted grape in California. And it is now still, I think, the third most planted grape in California after Chardonnay, which is number one, and Cabernet, which is number two. So it's still a profoundly interesting and important grape in California. All those red blends you see in California are at their core mostly Zinfandel.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. Well, one, I love talking about Zinfandel. I enjoy drinking it more, but you really have a sense of place because I always talk or promote Zinfandel as California's signature grape variety. Um, maybe Primitivo's a strain of that. I know it originated somewhere in Croatia, I believe, but it's like when the Argentinians talk about Malbec, even though it originated in Cahors, France, it's identified with Argentina, just like Zinfandel's associated with
Or
California.
Shirazes with Australia.
Exactly.
I got to go back to Croatia and sort of participate in a conference with Jancis Robinson and the two professors that helped Caro Meredith identify Croatian Zinfandel, which is now called Tribidrag. And it was fascinating because there are a lot of interesting grape varieties that come from there. And the fact that Zinfandel, which isn't planted there much anymore because it was highly susceptible to mildew, made its way to California, really through Austria to New York, and finally made its way to California. So it really migrated to the place where it found a home that was perfect for it because of the dryness of the summers here and the Mediterranean climate. It was actually probably a better place to be growing it than either Croatia or Italy, Primitivo, which is a clonal variation of Zinfandel for sure.
Right. So before we get to Ravenswood, let's just talk about Zinfandel back then. So did you learn your winemaking? Did you have the skill set to make wine before you met Andre and Joe Swan, or did you learn from them? And what did Zinfandel taste like in the 1970s? Does it taste like it does today?
Long question, but the answer is I didn't have the skills to make wine until I met Joe Swan and spent 1972 to 1976 with him and Andre, which is where I really learned the nuts and bolts of winemaking. I learned which side of a barrel was up and how pumps worked, and how to make wine in a very simple way. Joe Swan made all his wines in open top redwood fermenters, punched down by hand. He didn't use native yeast as I do, but he used all French oak. And Andre was kind of like a vigilant person within that sphere. So I learned a lot from them, but I did know a lot about wine. I had been tasting wine since I was 10, almost semi-professionally. I really began studying it again. I was doing medical research at the time. I was working in San Francisco with a laboratory associated with the UCSF. and we were studying lymphocytes and tumor cells and things like that. But I had a tasting group and was involved in several tasting groups. So I knew a lot about wine. And Zinfandel didn't really taste like it tastes now. I mean, yes, the grape tasted like it tastes, but much Zinfandel was made by very large wineries, and they used, large upright redwood tanks to age the wine in, and they believed in mellowing it and doing things like that. There were a few exceptions. There were people like Lee Stewart at Souverain, who was making really interesting Zinfandel. Ridge, Dave Benyon at Ridge, pre-Paul Draper,
Right.
had begun making really interesting Zinfandel. And Joe Swan, of course, was making really interesting Zinfandel, but they hadn't set out to make Zinfandel. They were interested in making other grape varieties. Ridge was interested in Cabernet, Joe Swan was interested in Pinot Noir, but they had to wait for those grapes to really come into fruition. So they were practicing a winemaking style with Zinfandel that was different than what had been practiced in the past. So
Okay.
they were making wine like they would make fine wine varieties. And it turned out that Zinfandel responded. I mean, post-prohibition, most Zinfandel was relegated to a jug. Gallo Hardy Burgundy was like the big seller, and it was mostly Zinfandel.
Jug wine. Okay.
So what these guys did was that they really changed the way the grape was respected and the way it was made into wine. And they used much more traditional European Bordeaux/Burgundian techniques to make these wines, which obviously worked.
Well, you have two amazing mentors to lean on
Oh yeah.
back then. That's incredible. That's incredible. So moving on to Ravenswood, what was your main ambition with the Ravenswood brand back then? If Zin, for the most part, maybe is seen as a jug wine, what was your main ambition then with this Ravenswood brand that just took off by storm?
Well, I was kind of moving back to the earth. My hair was down to my shoulders. I had counterculture ideas about the world, and I was going to do something that was simple and that I could do myself. And so starting a small winery, it was supposed to be a small winery. I was supposed to be doing all the work myself and making the wines. And it started out that way.
What
I
year?
took
What year was this, Joel?
1976. I made
1976.
437 cases of wine. I'm sorry, 327 cases of wine. There's an argument about that, but yeah, 327 cases of wine. That was Zinfandel. And it was Zinfandel from a couple of old mixed vineyards. So it was going to be small lots from special vineyards. And that was my idea. But it turns out that you couldn't make a living doing that. And, I had a child in 81 and I started a family and was working two jobs. By that time I had transferred to running a clinical laboratory in the middle of the night and on weekends. So it was a second job. And one of my partners, I had to take on partners in 1979. And one of them said, you should be making white Zin. It's hot. We need a cash flow wine. If we're not going to be around for much longer if you keep making wines that take 3 years to get out of the barn. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't do pink, I don't do sweet, I don't do wimpy, which was kind of the source of our No Wimpy Wines moniker. He said, well, you better think of something or we won't be here. So I came up with a red wine that I could turn around in a year. It was called Vintner's Blend.
Right.
And it sold for around $12 a bottle, which was, kind of like the low end, but still expensive, and it really took off. That was my first vintage of that was in 1983. By the time I sold the winery to Constellation, it was at about 400,000 cases, and Constellation ran it up to close to 1 million. So it was a pretty successful wine, to say the least.
That
And
just literally just took off within a relatively short period of time.
yeah, a combination of events happened. Yeah, the my first vintage of that was 1,000 cases, and it really began moving. We were into 20,000 cases 4 years later. Robert Parker showed up around 1987. Um, he loved the wines, and he gave Vintner's Blend a plug, but he also gave my single vineyard designates a plug. I mean, really, what I was about were single vineyard designated wines. Vintner's Blend was an interesting challenge, but I can't say it was what kept me going, through the whole process. But it was very nice cash flow wine, to say the least.
Okay, so what was I mean, besides the money, what was your main motivating factor to get out to sell to Constellation?
Um, well, there were a couple of things. I had taken on partners in 1979 because I'd run out of money, and and they were very dedicated and helpful throughout the years. But they were old when we got involved. I was in my 20s; they were in their 50s. So by the time um, uh, the 2000s roll around, they're in their 80s and they're looking for an exit strategy. And I don't have enough money to buy them out. In 1999, we went public. We were a public company traded on NASDAQ for a while, with the idea that it would give us some liquid asset that the partners could sell into. But it turned out that the markets never valued us for what we were worth, and they refused to sell. But when you're a corporation, you're run by a board. And while I owned the majority of the stock, I was not the only voice. And so my older partners decided that it was time to sell. The other motivating factor was the fact that when you're growing like we were growing at 20% a year on year. It's very expensive to grow like that. So we were going to have to sell more of the winery into the market in any case. So it became kind of Hobbs' choice. There was no win in this one. I would have preferred not to sell the winery, but the basic world conspired against me. But as it turned out, Constellation was a reasonably good partner in the early years, for sure.
And you stayed on board. You were involved at some point within Constellation as well, with the brand.
Oh yeah, I stayed on board with Ravenswood as the lead winemaker at Ravenswood, and then worked in their marketing department and did a lot of travel. So I stayed on with the brand until 2016, um, when the writing on the wall became clear that Constellation was moving away from that category of wine, and they thought that Zinfandel was a small category that really didn't have the capacity to grow the way they wanted to grow wine at the price they wanted to grow wine, which is why they bought Schrader and Mondavi,
Right.
and began and dumped things like Clos and Franciscan and others off to Gallo.
Yeah. Okay. No, no. I mean, fascinating story. Let's talk about the present. Let's talk about your newest project, Once and Future. I love the name. I know there's a lot of meaning behind the brand. So, what was the overriding factor for you to jump back in and start all over again from scratch with this Once and Future brand?
Well, part of it was that I knew I wouldn't make the same mistakes I made before.
Okay.
I've made whole new sets of mistakes, which is fun. Um, but I love winemaking. I love being part of the business. I like being in the vineyard. I like working, with the grapes, and obviously, I like sharing what I do with people. Um, and I figured that it was I was in my late 60s, when I started this in 2014. Um, and I figured I had 10 good working years left, and you have to ask yourself what you want to do with that. And you kind of look backwards and you kind of say, okay, when were you the happiest? When were you doing what you really wanted to do? not that it's been misery my entire life. It's been pretty fantastic. But um, what made me the happiest was actually physically making wine, getting dirty. You know, when you work as a winemaker at a large winery, you rarely get dirty. You're really telling other people how to get dirty.
Right.
So I wanted to go back to essentially what I had done with Joe Swannon and Andre. I started a winery where I resurrected my old redwood fermenters, and set the ones that I retired in the early '90s or late '90s actually, and went back to basically the physicality of punching down and working with special old vineyards of place, making wine kind of like a small Burgundian producer might make wine, and there's something very satisfying about that. So I'm old enough so I get to do exactly what I want to do, and
No, and it's keeping you young, right? I mean, you love
I,
what you
I
do.
hope so.
Yeah, I mean, you're smiling, you're happy doing what you do. Where are you making these wines? Where are you getting hands dirty once you're bringing in the grapes? Is there one physical location where you're doing all this stuff, punching down and everything?
I am very fortunate to have a son who is a master of wine and also has his own winery called Bedrock Wine Company. And he's been kind enough to let me have a corner of his winery for
Oh,
mine. And his
okay.
winery is really a state-of-the-art, beautiful, winery. Um, but if you come to my section of the winery, it looks like a historical display of old winemaking implements. So you go down the rows of beautiful stainless steel tanks, and you get to my redwood fermenters that sometimes leak.
The
And,
museum room, then you're in the you're in the
like
museum area
so,
of the winery.
so I get to make wine at Bedrock, and I'm grateful for that. I also get help from his interns when I need it. And
Okay.
so so the glory is that I don't have to worry about running a winery or personnel or anything like that at this point. I just get to do the best parts of this business.
And your son, this is Morgan Twain. Is he involved in some aspect of this process, whether it's in the vineyard or in the winery? Is it just you in the winery making these wines?
Well, he's a hyphenated name, so he's a Twain Peterson. So he's Morgan Twain Peterson. It's essentially my project. Do we help each other? Sure. I taste with him when we're tasting his wines. He tastes with me. But literally, I do my own, my blending. I do my own punch downs. He has a great vineyard team. Sometimes they'll go out and do sugars for me when I can't get to all the vineyards that I work with in a particular week if it gets particularly intense. So we support each other, but we kind of stay out of each other's hair, so to speak.
Okay. Well, that's great. Well, you have a place to make these wines. So I have to tell you, I purchased a bottle of your Bedrock Vineyard 2017, your Bedrock Vineyard Zinfandel 2017 from a really cool wine shop here in London, NYSA Wines on Fulham Road in Chelsea. And since they've opened that shop, they have two more. So you're literally with these wines going back to your roots, to what you originally had set out for, I guess, at Ravenswood. So has your approach to making Zinfandel changed since 1976?
Um, I'd have to say that I went back to the way I was making Zinfandel
Okay.
in 1976. I basically built a winery where we were, the modern technological example of a high quality winery. Lots of stainless steel, all the bells and whistles that you needed in terms of filters, et cetera, et cetera. Because we were making nearly 1 million cases of wine. So I've gone back to pretty primitive winemaking. I have very few of those implements. I'm about as close to natural wine. If I didn't use sulfur in the winemaking process, I would be considered to be a natural winemaker. Um,
Oh,
and so I am using great vineyards and essentially open top redwood fermenters, punched down by hand, native yeast fermentation, French oak at varying levels and varying time in barrel, depending on what the wine needs. So each wine is pretty much custom made, and they come from vineyards that have actually very unique characters about them.
so these redwood fermenters, did you unretire these fermenters, or did you have to buy new? Did you have to buy new fermenters, redwood fermenters?
No, I unretired these fermenters. These
Wow.
are fermenters that have been with me since the late 80s and early 90s, which I retired effectively. I think I used the last one in 2002, but we hid them away, and they were still available when I left Ravenswood. So I scurried away with them. Uh,
That's an awesome story. So this Bedrock Zinfandel, what is the overriding factor that gives this Zin a true sense of place from this Bedrock vineyard?
Well, it's really what gives every famous wine its sense of place. The soil, the climate, the grape mix in this particular case. Um, it's yeah, and really the history of the vineyard and how it's been grown for so long. So it's on the Agua Caliente bench in Sonoma Valley, which is a relatively cool climate. It has the same heat summation as Forestville, which is where they grow Pinot Noir. The heat comes at a slightly different variation, so it's good. Their vines were planted in 1888, so the crop levels are low. They're 1.5 to 2.5 tons an acre in any given year. There's a vineyard mix that includes 26 different grape varieties in this particular vineyard. My wines are probably 75 or 76% Zinfandel, with small amounts of everything from Petit Syrah to Carignan to Alicante to Negrette to Castet to Grenache. So there's a lot of really interesting varieties that were planted. The vineyard was planted at a time when they were still experimenting with grapes, but they also knew that making great Zinfandel involved supporting Zinfandel with other grape varieties because of its propensity to produce very high alcohol wines. So most of the grape varieties that are in the vineyard ripen after Zinfandel. So you're mixing less ripe varieties, not underripe, but less ripe varieties with a fully ripe variety in Zinfandel.
Okay, and then are these individual? You got 75% Zin, for example, in this Bedrock Zinfandel. Then are you fermenting and aging everything separately before, I guess, blending the final product? How does that work?
Oh no, it's co-fermentation, and that is the key to these old vineyards. You have to understand the gestalt of the vineyard, the kind of like when it is ready as a whole, um, and the different components within that vineyard, the different chemistry, in fact, within the different grapes. Some have more anthocyanin, some have less, some have more tannin, some has less. Um, when they all come together in a fermenter and create this melange, they create a wine that is stronger than any of the individual parts and probably more interesting and more vintage based than any wine you would make by trying to separate the grape varieties and make them separately. Beyond that, it would be impossible because the grape
Okay.
varieties are planted randomly within the vineyard.
I see. I see. So then small yields. So what's production? What's case production for this Bedrock Vineyard Zinfandel of yours?
It's typically 300 to 400 cases, depending on the vintage.
Okay. And in terms of what's your business model then, Joel? Are you sourcing from growers? Do you own vineyards as well as a combination of the two?
It's really a combination of the two. I own Bedrock Vineyard. It was a vineyard that I bought in 2002 because they were going to tear out this old vine Zinfandel, which is totally historic, and plant Cabernet. And I wasn't I wasn't for that. But I also work with growers that are equally dedicated to growing great old vines and taking care of them. So I work with the Teldeskis that I've worked with since 1982 in Dry Creek. Morgan also works with them. I work with Old Hill Ranch, which is a vineyard I've worked with for, since the early 80s as well. So a vineyard planted in 1885. I'm working with own rooted vines out in Oakley, Mataro and Zinfandel, vines planted in the late 1880s. So really, I'm working with historic vineyards. I'm working with vineyards that are grown by people who care about what they do. And because I can get a reasonably good bottle price for my wines, I can actually pay them enough to help them keep those vines in the ground, which is critically important in my opinion, because they really are the heritage vines of California.
So that's your vision then for these vineyards, is just to keep them going.
That's exactly right. Keep them going. And beyond just keeping them going, letting people know what great wine they make. This isn't average wine. This is way better than average wine. And these are the key vineyards of California, the vineyards that ultimately should be shaping the reputation and the character of California wine.
So some place like Bedrock Vineyard, um, um, is your son then making a Zin, a wine from this vineyard? I mean, how many cases overall you selling fruit? I mean, how much can this one vineyard produce?
Well, it's one of the oldest stands of old vines in certainly Sonoma County. It's about 35 acres of
30.
vineyard, and we split this up between my son, Bob Bialy, Ridge, um, Mike Officer at Carlisle, um, uh, the Curly, Tegan.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, we have gone out and found the best Zinfandel producers in California to produce um, wine from this vineyard. And most of them are producing, with the exception of Morgan, who is producing more, most of them are producing between 300 and 500 cases
Mm-hmm.
of these grapes. But Morgan produces a little bit more. In fact, his Bedrock Vineyard was the number 10 um, vineyard, number 10 wine on the Spectator's Top 100 list uh,
Amazing.
2 years ago.
Amazing. So how do you keep, I mean, these are seriously old vines going back to, 1880s. Like I said, mentioned earlier, you're on the board of the Historic Vineyard Society. How much longer can these old vines go? How much longer can they continue to produce juice? Or you can't, is it too difficult to predict?
Well, if they're taken care of uh, in perpetuity, not every vine in the vineyard was planted, say, in 1888. Obviously, when the vineyard was planted, the next year vines died. There were misses that didn't. So in 1889, they planted more grapevines. So when handled correctly, you are replacing the vines that die, but the average age of the vineyard stays very old.
Okay.
So there are always younger vines and older vines, but the older vines are really creating the informative character for the vineyard.
So do you have to work pretty hard then to make sure these vines are looked after? Is it hard? Is it hard work in the vineyard looking after these vines?
Well, it's vigilant work, and Zinfandel requires, particularly head prune Zinfandel, a fair amount of handwork because it has a propensity to, be very vigorous. Even old vines are fairly vigorous, so we do a lot of shoot thinning and making sure that we're, holding things to one cluster per shoot so the cluster stays small. Um, and yes, it's a fair amount of work, but it's not unpleasurable work. It's the kind of work that doesn't really feel like work.
Well, it's the kind of work that I guess brought you back to this project, right?
Oh yeah.
Now that's really cool. So you mentioned Mataro or Mourvèdre, so in addition to Zinfandel, you produce these other wines. You have a Mataro from Contra Costa. I'm guessing production is tiny here. I mean, how much is planted to Mataro in California, let alone the Sierra foothills?
Well, Contra Costa isn't the Sierra foothills. It's
Oh,
due east
sorry.
of San Francisco, right along the Delta, and so it gets a lot of the sea breeze that comes in across the Delta and over Sassoon Bay. So that's what makes it a good growing region. The fact that it's planted essentially in sand dunes, when you look at these soils, they're quite remarkable.
Okay.
Um, that Phloxera can't grow in them, so they can grow on their own roots. And they were planted in probably the 1890s. Pretty pretty remarkable place. There's not that much Mataro planted in California. You know, we have a stand of it at Bedrock, actually, which is mixed with a few other grape varieties, but it's primarily Mataro. Mataro is the California name for Mourvedre or
Mhm.
Monastrell. And, you know, there's a little planted here and there. It was one of the grape varieties that California was experimenting with when they were putting together these mixed vineyards. So there are a lot of mixed vineyards out there that have, you know, some Mataro associated with them or some Mourvedre associated with them. There are, but the plantings are relatively small. I make about 300 or 400 cases of that wine as well. I share that vineyard with Tegan. Because I'm a small winery and because my fermentation lots are roughly 6 tons of grapes a piece, one of the ways that we make it work for all of us is that we find these old vineyards and we share them. So I share the Mataro at Oakley Road in Contra Costa with Tegan. He has his own private label called Sandlands, which is beyond what he does at Turley. So we're all in cahoots here.
Okay. And then, so then I guess, again, going back to your business model, then is your intent then is to keep production low. You're not
My,
going to scale these out like you did Ravenswood.
no, no, no. My intent is to be able to do the majority of the work myself, which means that there's a certain amount of physicality involved with that. And so I will probably never make more than a total of 3,000 cases. That's about where I am now. It might slip to 4,000 in some years, depending on what's going on. You know, I'm always looking for great old vineyards of which I can, you know, make a small amount of wine. But, you know, but literally the rule is you can only make as much wine as you can make yourself, you know, with
Okay.
from your friends.
So I'm assuming that these wines, because if you're making 4,000 cases max, these wines are tightly allocated. So are you selling these wines off your, website direct to consumer? Are they going to restaurants? Where are these wines going in the United States?
Well, about 40% are sold direct. So I have a website and I do one release a year to my customer base that have all signed up for wines and they're very dedicated to buying these wines. So that's very nice. Um, I sell wines in the world in places I like to go. So I sell wines to, say, the Wine Society and Indigo in the UK. I sell wines to Martell in Switzerland. And I sell wines to Nakagawa in Japan because Japan's a great wine country, and it's a fun place to visit. I also have distributors in key markets in the United States, so obviously New York and Chicago and California. So my wines are available. I wouldn't call them widely available, but they're available. And obviously restaurants are important, but obviously in the last year that has not been a key source of outlet for wine, just because most of the restaurants have been shut down.
Right.
But I'd like to have my mix out there in the world be, you know, 30 to 40% restaurant on
Yeah.
premise.
Yeah. And over here, I mean, you have a super fan in Sarah Knowles. Um,
She's great.
Sarah's
Yeah.
awesome. She was on the podcast a while back, and she's a huge fan. And I believe, because I just saw the wines back up on their website, so I believe they just got a new shipment in. And
Yep.
and from what I can see, buying this bottle of NYSA wines, Ben Henshaw over at Indigo's, doing a good job for you as well. And the restaurants are finally opened up again, so we'll see more once in future on Wine List as well, right?
That's what we're hoping for. Yeah.
So tell me about 2020, Joel. Tough year for everybody in California. Are you releasing a 2020 vintage due to these fires that just took California literally by storm in August and September?
The answer is yes. I am releasing some wines from the 20 vintage. So I had gotten up with the 19 vintage to about 3,000 cases. I'll be
Mm-hmm.
back down to about 12 to 1,500 cases in 2020. So the grapes at in Contra Costa, Oakley, ripen early. So they ripened and were picked before the fires. Interestingly enough, I picked Teldeschi the same day the fires started from the lightning storm in the Dry Creek area. So those were definitely not smoke tainted.
Okay.
Um, and then there were vineyards that I had to, not make wine from. So Petit Syrah from Palisades, because the fire burned right up to the edge of it. A great vineyard in Green and Red, where the fire burned right up to it in Childs Valley in Napa. Um, but there were other vineyards that were the smoke, where I would call the smoke was old smoke. So I make wines from Dickerson Vineyard in Napa Valley, um, and a wine from the Carneros, Merlot, which were picked after the fires. All these wines were sent out to the Australian research group that does smoke effect analysis,
Mm-hmm.
and they all came back negative.
Oh, great.
So that was great. So the glycosides are perfect. It was interesting because it turns out that some grapes, like Syrah, for instance, have components in them that mimic smoke effect. The good news was that I had the 2019 wines, and I sent the 2019 wines as a control along with the 2020 wines. So I could tell exactly which ones were in fact smoke affected and which ones weren't. Um,
Okay. Amazing. So if you look, if you look at California, I think it was like 2007, 2008, fires broke out. Before harvest, you have 2017, fires broke out after the majority of the harvest was in. 2020, has there been a more difficult year for making wine in California in 2020 that you can remember?
yeah, there have been some difficult years in part because for other reasons. So if you look at like 1996, we had these hot Scirocco winds that came in as the grapes were approaching 21 or 22. And by the time the winds stopped blowing, the grapes were at 28, but they weren't ripe. They were green, they were essentially green flavored grapes with high sugars. And that was difficult to make good wine out of. And the so there have been other years. There was, you look at things like 88 was the same. 96 no, excuse me, 98 we had rains towards the end, which created a lot of botrytis. So we have winemaking difficulties here associated with weather, but I can't say that I can remember a vintage that was as complex as 2020 when it be as or and was and or as challenging. The smoke obviously created a whole nother level of complication. We had some heat spells that created some issues. But I have to say, that I'm always amazed at how well wines turn out in vintages that are complicated for winemakers. So we'd just been through 2018, which was like the perfect vintage. Um, and then you get to 2020 where you're challenged at all levels. And yet, the wines that I'm releasing, I'm quite happy with. They're fine.
And these old vines or vineyards that you're working with that are going back over 100 years, I mean, obviously they're super resilient. Did you lose any part of any vineyards or any rows as a result of these fires, or you came away unscathed?
Well, we lost a few rows of Old Hill in one of the fires, not the 2020 fires. Um, at Green and Red, the fire burned right up to the vineyard, but it didn't destroy any vines, remarkably. At Palisades, which is the Petit Syrah vineyard, old Petit Syrah vineyard, it burned around the vineyard and in the entire hillside behind the vineyard, but didn't do any damage to the vineyard. So um, really the vineyards I work with were unscathed. I mean,
Amazing.
yeah, they were devastated because of the smoke taint to the grapes, but
Sure.
the vines themselves lived to produce another vintage.
That's great. They just go dormant and you just start all over again, correct?
Exactly.
Very good. Well, listen, Joel, I want to thank you for being on the road with me this week. But before you go, I'm going to ask you 4 questions. I call this the bin end Q&A. So give me your first answer. You ready to go?
I'm ready to go.
Okay. What wine did your folks drink when you were growing up?
Oh my God. My parents were wine aficionados. They were Berkeley Wine and Food Society founders. Um, they drank a lot of wine, but I would say mostly they drank Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Riesling from Germany, mostly European wines.
Mostly European wines. Very good. Living or dead, which celebrity would you most enjoy sharing a bottle of your Bedrock Vineyard Zinfandel?
Oh, I think I would love to share a bottle of wine with Orson Welles. He was the no wine before its time guy for Paul Masson.
You're right. Yes.
He clearly loved wine, and he was an interesting human being. So he was cantankerous and difficult, but brilliant. And so sharing a bottle of wine with him would be great fun because he would appreciate the wine. He would appreciate the old vine Zinfandel, but there'd be a lot to talk about.
Lots of
And
talking. Go on.
I suppose if I had to choose somebody that's not really a celebrity per se, I'd love to share a bottle of wine with Agustin Harristy, who was a big supporter. He didn't bring Zinfandel into California, but he's a big supporter and an advocate of Zinfandel, just to show him how much things had changed and to really get the true dope, what he was doing back then.
Yeah, Mr. Buena Vista. So can you imagine Agustin and Orson Welles at the same table? You probably have to open a couple cases, right? You wouldn't get away with just.
Boy, they were both movers and shakers. That would have been fascinating. I would have been outclassed for sure.
I'm not sure about that. If you could make wine, and if you could make wine anywhere else in the world, where would it be, and which grape variety?
Priorat. I'd love to make wine in Spain with Grenache and Carignan from those old bush vines. That would be pretty nice. And Spanish food's not bad either.
Spanish food's not bad, but I tell you, those terrace vineyards in Priorat, I mean, just it's a beautiful place. And you're right, those wines are gorgeous.
Yeah, no, but it would be a dream.
Money, no object. Money, no object. Which bottle of California wine would you open with dinner tonight? And it cannot be one of yours.
Okay, well, obviously it would depend on what I was eating mostly, and it probably wouldn't necessarily be an expensive wine, but I have to say that if I was forced, to choose a wine that I'd love to drink again, I'd would probably be 1995 Jamais Côte Rôtie. It has all the things that I love about wine. It has the signature of place. It has the heart of a human who's very dedicated to the wines, and it tastes great. It's like it got the core value of great wine is that it tastes great.
Great answer. Well, listen, Joel, I really enjoyed our conversation this afternoon, or your morning and my evening. And I want to thank you very much for being on the road with me this week and your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the time that it takes to reach out and get me on your show. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Great seeing you, Joel. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.